The proceeding will start.
Order, order. Good morning and welcome to this meeting of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. Today the committee is holding its third oral evidence session in our Civil Service Leadership and Reform Inquiry. Recent high-profile tensions between ministers and their officials have called into question whether the model of an independent, impartial civil service that serves the government of the day remains fit for purpose in the 21st century, or whether a fresh understanding of the relationship between the government and the civil service is needed. Today we'll be hearing from Jonathan Slater, formerly Permanent Secretary at the Department for Education and Head of the Civil Service Policy Profession. The session will examine whether Whitehall policy making is fundamentally disconnected from both delivery and the people affected by it, and the solution suggested to resolve this issue. Good morning, Mr. Slater. Could you please introduce yourself for the record?
Hello, my name is Jonathan Slater. Delighted to be here this morning.
Mr. Slater, you're the author of a report entitled Fixing Whitehall's Broken Policy Machine, and in that report you're critical of the dominance of the so-called courtier skills at the top of the civil service and in the policy profession. How far would you say that reflects the preferences of ministers who expect to have little time to get to grips with their jobs or to make significant changes?
It's not been my experience over the 20 years that I was a civil servant that the ministers that I worked for, from John Reid to David Cameron to Gavin Williamson to Justine Greening and many others, it's not been my experience that what they wanted from their senior civil servants were courtiers. No. In general, what they wanted were experts on their subject matter who could advise without fear or favour, and once the ministers had decided what they wanted to get done, would implement it with all due speed and skill. So I conclude from that the courtier culture, which has been widely reported on, not least by Fulton in the 1960s, is not because ministers want it to be so. They're busy people, they come into government, they get on with running the country, they inherit a civil service with a predominant culture, and they don't have the time or inclination to change it.
How would you say that culture developed?
So it's developed over a very long period of time, at least 100 years. And I argued in my pamphlet that you referred to that it's a consequence, it seems to me, of a system in which operates in private. If you do have a system in which the civil servants are operating behind closed doors, not really meeting members of the public, I'm here talking about the policymakers, again a criticism that was made of the civil service in the 1960s. If they're operating behind closed doors in meetings with ministers, and nothing else really, this is the very first time I've been able to express my views to a group of MPs. While I was a civil servant, I was forbidden from expressing my views. That inevitably encourages a culture in which civil servants are sort of wondering what it is their ministers would like them to say, more than anything else.
It's strange that should develop and that the civil servants themselves shouldn't have sufficient self-awareness to see that this is a process that is perhaps not necessarily serving the best interests of the government of the day.
When I was the Permanent Secretary of the Department for Education, I saw it as an important duty that I would attend the induction meetings of all new starters, all new civil servants joining the Department for Education, since I was the head of the department. And without exception, as I would ask them, having arrived in the civil service fresh, in their 20s typically, not always, but nevertheless normally, why had they become civil servants? They would almost always give me the same answer. It was to make a difference. It was to achieve results on behalf of the government of the day. So it's not the case that people join the civil service with anything other than ambition to do their best for the government. And plenty of civil servants go through their whole career doing so. Again, if I'm talking here about policymakers, what they soon discover is that their ability to achieve real outcomes on behalf of the ministers they're serving is not typically what gets them promoted. It isn't what gets them promoted. That's not a controversial statement. How could it be otherwise, given how quickly civil servants move from one job to another? It takes a bit of time to get something done. If you got promoted within 12 months, you can be pretty confident nothing much has been achieved on your watch. And so junior people see senior people getting promoted because of their ability to manage upwards, to handle issues on behalf of ministers, rather than because of their subject matter expertise or their ability to achieve real change on the ground. I'm oversimplifying, but that is the predominant culture, and so it's inevitable that ambitious civil servants wanting to get more senior start, despite the reasons that they joined, to see that what is going to make the biggest difference to their career is not necessarily their subject matter expertise. Again, they can see that's not being prioritised. Good people have got promoted within 12 months. They couldn't possibly have developed the expertise. They're switching from department to department. And so the culture takes over.
And how useful are the so-called courtiers?
So ministers need a whole set of skills and people supporting them to achieve their jobs. And so certainly I wouldn't have, I wasn't surprised if ministers that I worked for weren't only asking me what was the best way to teach mathematics or to recruit French teachers and that sort of expertise, but also how did I think we were best placed to get the support of a reluctant chancellor? Or how was this going to play in the Education Select Committee? Or what was the best way of handling what was inevitably going to be a difficult set of questions when the minister was in front of his or her team? So if that's what you mean by courtier skills, helping the minister sort of handle the complexity of a political environment, of course ministers need those people. I'm not so sure, though, that they benefit from getting those skills from the senior civil service. Francis Maud has argued in favour of an extended ministerial office, for example, inviting ministers to bring in people that they've chosen to help them to achieve their objective. Not because of their expertise in the subject matter, but precisely because, as your question implies, it's a complicated world and you need some allies helping you to navigate your way through it. If it were me, I would give ministers the opportunity to recruit more people to help them with the courtier skills, the handling, and get the civil service focused on what we all say it's for: experts, impartial advice, getting it done. Which doesn't really, the word courtier does not exist in that sentence. But if you were to do a diary for your typical senior civil servant in Whitehall, they'd spend much more time on the courtier and much less time on the advice.
The development of cross-government functions and professions was designed to improve civil service skills in key areas, and there's been a huge expansion in the number of commercial, digital, project management specialists, for example. How far has that addressed the concerns about generalism and the lack of expertise that you refer to?
So it certainly is the case, as you say, Chair, that over the last 20 years, the civil service has recruited many specialists. When I joined in 2001, government departments weren't required to have finance directors, let alone accountancy qualified finance directors, and now they are. That would be just one of many examples. But what I was struck by in my 20 years in the civil service, including, as you say, as head of the policy profession, was that these specialists were at one stage remove still from the decision-making process. The room where the minister, with his or her policy officials, makes the decision. The policymaker isn't a specialist in anything other than one thing I'll come back to in a minute. They see their job, again, I'm oversimplifying, it's complicated, but it more than anything else, they see their job as going to get the views of the experts including commercial and digital people and project managers, synthesising it and reporting back and having the conversation with the minister. To bring this to life, I remember a meeting of Wednesday morning colleagues, the meetings that permanent secretaries hold on their own in private and have done on Wednesday mornings for 100 years, where the chief scientific advisor at the time was recommending that the fast stream, which is the recruitment process into the policy-making profession, should recruit more scientists. You might think an uncontroversial proposal. Speaking as a mathematician, I was certainly in favour. I wasn't the head of the policy profession at the time. My predecessor was doing it, and he said no. We need scientists in the science fast stream, not in the generalist policy-making fast stream. I mean, I think that really does bring it to life. If you're not having scientists in the policy fast stream, well, what are they then? I mean, I suppose they are historians. They're classicists. They're people who are recruited on the basis of their ability to synthesise the views of lots of experts and put it in front of a minister. Now, that's a thing. That's a thing. But I did sometimes wonder whether you might just occasionally cut out the middleman or the middlewoman. Why not put the experts in front of the minister?
And has anyone before you ever thought of changing the structure or reviewing it?
So there's nothing unique about me. And as I say, this analysis of the way that ministers in the country are not as well served as they might be by this generalist group of people. I'm certainly not the first person to argue that this needs to change. It's not typical for ex-permanent secretaries to be the ones arguing for it. And I don't think that that's because there's anything special about me either, other than I didn't spend the whole of my career in the civil service. I spent the first half of it in local government, which is untypical. It's not unique, but it's untypical. And I sometimes reflect, what if I had had the standard career, Oxford, PPE, fast stream, joining the best civil service in the world? That's what you're told. Rolls-Royce. Would I, 20 years later, have been as ambitious for change as I am? Probably not. You can see why the system sort of takes over in the way that I've described. It's just that because I did spend 10 years working for democratically elected politicians, an impartial official with the responsibility to advise these politicians and then get on with implementing their decisions, exactly the same as the civil service, but in local government, it was inevitable that I was going to compare the two things. Doubly so since the politicians that I worked for at Islington included Stephen Twigg, Meg Hillier, James Purnell, Margaret Hodge. So it's the same politicians in some cases. And I did expect joining the civil service to be arriving in a place that was essentially the same, just more complicated and bigger. But I couldn't have been more wrong. This idea that you do it in secret in the civil service, but you do it in public in local government, is so fundamental. But if I joined the civil service at the age of 21 and never done anything other than operated behind closed doors, I would have believed that it was not possible to do it any other way, which is indeed what most of my colleagues today think. I just know they're wrong because I've done it a different way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jo Kitty.
Thank you. Complaints about excessive churn in the civil service are long-standing. To what extent is churn a product of a civil service culture that accords too little importance to expertise, rather than as a result of falling real wages and the lack of in-post advancement?
So I do think that the fundamental reason for the churn is that civil service leaders who are choosing who to promote, because that's when the churn happens, don't prioritise expertise, don't prioritise delivery record. It can't be that the primary cause is money, because this has been with us for at least 50 years. The words in the Fulton report are essentially the same. It has got worse in the last 10 years because there is an added financial incentive now on people to get promoted quickly because it is the best way of getting paid, a pay rise, but it has been with us for at least 50 years. As the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Education, I would be invited by my colleagues on a fairly regular basis to see person X or person Y who worked for them. I remember a conversation I had with somebody who wanted to join the Department for Education. What do you do? I saw him out of courtesy to my colleague, bright young guy. What do you do? You know, I won't tell you, I won't name the person, obviously, but I'm involved in regulating this very complicated thing that is currently unregulated. How long have you been doing it for? 12 months. Why do you want to come to the Department for Education? I'm really interested in schools. This guy was sent to me by one of my fellow permanent secretaries. It's completely absurd.
So, how far would allowing in-post progression help to change this culture?
Sorry, would you mind repeating?
Yes, how far would allowing in-post progression help to change the culture if people could be advanced without having to
yes,
change
it's,
the path?
of course, absolutely. If you are asking people to stay in their role for, say, 3 or 4 years, the Minister wants advice about how to get something done, you work on the advice, the Minister makes a decision, you implement the change, let's say that takes 3 or 4 years. You know, an ambitious person who's got the capability to go upwards needs to know that there is a good opportunity for financial reward if they succeed. And so you would need to design your HR systems to facilitate that. But that would be a very straightforward thing to do. What happens at the moment is that every few years there's a new civil service reform plan announced, published, fanfare. We're going to provide opportunities for people to get paid for what they achieve in practice. Never sees the light of day. Why doesn't it see the light of day? Because the underlying problem is that people know that to get to the top, you don't stick around. Don't stick around in the job for 3 years. You're reducing your chances of getting to the top. After all, if my promotion was dependent upon me achieving successfully, that's quite hard. If my promotion is dependent instead on impressing a minister before they move on to something else, that's a lot easier. That is a lot easier. So you can see why the civil service doesn't change the system.
Yeah.
I wonder if I could just ask you a short question on that. I mean, how many moves did you have after joining the civil service before you became a permanent secretary?
I went from the Cabinet Office in 2001 to the Home Office in 2006. I think the change to the Ministry of Justice I'm going to excuse myself for, because that was a machinery of government change. I would have stayed in the Home Office. I was doing the same job. So I moved from the Home Office stroke Ministry of Justice to the Ministry of Defence in 2011. So I suppose it was 5-5. I was recruited, this is a good example, I was recruited into the Ministry of Defence to implement a set of reforms for Liam Fox, the Levine review of the Defence Operating Model. And that was a 3-year programme. And I implemented those changes, and those were implemented to the satisfaction of the Secretary of State at the time. And then the question, then I think I sort of demonstrated to the satisfaction of the most senior people that I'd got the skills required to be a sort of credible candidate for a permanent secretary role in the future. There was just one thing, there was just one rounding off that I required, possibly because I had the first half of my career being in local government. I had to show that I could do the politics. It turns out the sort of finishing job for potential permanent secretaries, if you're really lucky, is to be the head of the Economic and Domestic Secretariat. That's the sort of ultimate DG role. If you've been given that job, the next one will be a permanent secretary. So that's the job where you go along to cabinet meetings and you write the minutes. By far the easiest Director General job, obviously, I did.
Thank you. Sorry, Joe.
Okay. Many former ministers have attacked civil service competence, but some have also attacked its integrity, suggesting that some officials have deliberately resisted or undermined government policy. How would you respond to that?
So I never saw that myself. I worked in a number of different departments for at least 15 different secretaries of state, different political parties over 20 years. I'm not saying it's never happened, but I never saw it. You join the civil service certainly to make a difference, but you join it recognising you're operating for elected politicians. And it's really exciting working with elected politicians and building the trust and confidence of your next minister, and increasingly that opportunity arises quite frequently. So I saw all of my colleagues, and who, I've been a little bit critical already, but I never saw anything like that. I saw them really leaning in. What does the minister want? How can I get it for them? If anything, I agree with Francis Maud. There's not enough truth to power. And this is not a new comment. I arrived in 2001. I was excited, mid-30s. Where is it? I remember thinking 23 years ago, where is it happening? And of course, that isn't to say there isn't any of it, and of course there is. And it tends to happen behind closed doors for understandable reasons. But I don't think there's enough.
Amy Moore.
Thank you. Good morning. Can Cabinet Secretaries provide both the necessary support for the Prime Ministers and Cabinets and effective leadership of the civil service?
So it's a very big and complicated organisation, as you say, and the head of it has got a whole series of tasks to accomplish. And I would say, just like any large organisation, complicated organisation, you're unlikely to find one person that's got all the skills to do everything. And just like any other large, complicated organisation, what matters is the team of people at the top. I mean, that would be the same true politically, wouldn't it? The Prime Minister's can achieve a lot, but his or her team is a very important part of it. That would be the same true of any organisation, a bank, a football, a football team, not a football team, a football club. And so what you definitely need in the head of the civil service is the ability to lead an organisation of 400,000 people, because they are the boss of it. And you need someone who's sufficiently self-aware that they know what they're strong at and what they need help from, and that they can bring together a team. Where I saw this operate best in my 20 years was when Gus O'Donnell was head of the civil service, and he worked in an extremely effective partnership with Jeremy Hayward, who was the permanent secretary number 10. And between the two of them, they provided the combination of skills that you refer to, with Gus focusing more of his personal effort on the leadership and Jeremy more on the cabinet. And it was a double act that made it work really well, with Gus focusing on the leadership, because the top man or woman is in the end the leader.
And do you think the Cabinet Secretary could lead reform?
I think that the reform of any organisation has to come from the top person, absolutely. It's possible that behind your question you're exploring a sort of separation of the two roles. Yes, you are, fine. And so if you did separate the two roles, then the one on the senior one, because one's got to be more senior than the other, otherwise, well, yeah, any organisation needs a leader. The more senior one has to be the leader, not, well, the secretary, not the person who writes the minutes, but the leader. But, and that person has to be driving the reform agenda. If you do it the other way around, if the person who is advising the cabinet, but not leading the organisation, sort of delegates the leadership task to a number two, if you do it that way around, what will happen, and I've seen it happen before in a similar model, is the permanent secretaries, again, this will be true of any organisation, they look to the top person. They don't look to the second person, they look to the person at the top for direction. What's the person at the top doing? They're taking the minutes. So do it the other way around if you want to split it, as was done very well. I mean, we did, Gus was both Cabinet Secretary and head of the Civil Service. Whether you split the role or not doesn't really matter. What you need at the top is a really strong leader who works with a team of people who can complement their strengths. And nobody could do the sort of political handling better than Jeremy. So Gus left it to him.
Thank you. You do not focus on the role of the government in reforming the civil service. How far can changes of the sort you recommend in your report be introduced by the civil service itself without active ministerial support?
So the civil service can get on. I mean, the civil service can't do anything without ministerial approval. Otherwise, we wouldn't be living in a democracy. As is evident from a previous question, the civil service has recruited lots of specialists in the last 20 years. It has made change, but that required political oversight because it's democracy, but also because civil servants, want to be following ministerial direction, and so Francis Maude was a very effective Minister for the Cabinet Office in driving the recruitment of those specialists. He worked hand in glove with John Manzoni and others, and together they did it, and they did it well. So it definitely requires ministerial oversight because, well, that's the system, which I think is why it doesn't happen. The sort of reform I'm describing, it's fairly easy for people outside to see that the civil service doesn't really have, or hasn't had, say, the digital skills required. And you can quite imagine some ministers coming in 15 years ago and thinking we're going to have to fix that, and so they did. The sort of issue I'm describing, what goes on in those closed rooms, how much truth to power is there in practice, how do people actually get promoted in reality, you only see that when you're in. You don't see that really when you're outside. And once you're in, well, you've got bigger priorities. I mean, I wrote about this subject not because I think it's the biggest problem facing the country today, but because it was something I knew about, and I thought it would be good to change it. But if I were the Prime Minister, I could see why I might prioritise something else.
And then to what extent should the civil service be required to maintain and enhance its capability regardless of ministerial prioritisation? I wouldn't accept
the word regardless of, because that implies, I hear what you say, Minister, but I'm going to prioritise training the next lot over you meeting your needs, no matter what, and then we're not in a democracy anymore. But I certainly do think, and so would my colleagues, that this would be not uncontroversial, that it is important for the civil service to be preparing for future generations. It's a recognised role of the civil service that they need to be ready for an incoming government. The whole point of a permanent civil service is that it's ready for the next lot. But the incentives on civil servants would be to do rather less of that, and instead prioritise impressing your minister today. Of course it would be. And so there are some countries that have, some parliamentary democracies that have put in law the requirement on the civil service to do the planning for the future thing. You could argue that. That might not be a bad idea. I wouldn't see it as an important issue either way, particularly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tom Randall.
Thank you, Chairman. There's a lot of discussion about diversity in the civil service using the sort of Common Equality Act sort of characteristics, but I understand that you've been critical of the lack of socio-economic and geographical diversity in the policy profession and the senior civil service more generally. If policy is being based on proper sort of evidence bases and developed that way, why should policy be dependent upon the demographic characteristics of the civil servant creating it if it is an evidence-driven policy?
Because it isn't. My thesis is that ministers are poorly served by a policy-making profession that inadequately puts in front of them the evidence, because they don't know it well enough. And although that might seem critical and controversial, in a way it can't be if people move their jobs every year. How could they possibly know the evidence well enough to put it in front of a minister? It isn't happening. I don't mean it's never happening, but it's not the predominant system. If you were then to ask yourself, what is the best way of making sure that the civil service does put better evidence in front of a minister, I think it wouldn't be uncontroversial to argue that part of putting a comprehensive set of options in front of ministers, thinking through the practical implications on the ground of choices A, B and C, that it wouldn't be uncontroversial to argue that task is likely to be done better if all the people working on it aren't all exactly the same as each other. I mean, that's the sort of case for bringing people with different experiences, expertise to bear on looking into a question. If they've all been to the same university, all had the same background, they're unlikely to draw upon all of the different perspectives. I mean, government is a very complicated business, isn't it? And in the Department for Education, I was having to work out what was the practical implications likely to be on the ground of a change in, as I mentioned earlier, the maths curriculum, which requires you not just to be an expert in mathematics, but an expert in children, and very different children. The biggest problem confronting the school system is that, since time began, some children do a lot better at school than other children, and children whose parents have got more resources do better than those with fewer resources. Understanding that issue, really, what would it take? Well, how might you support the parents of children who've failed at maths themselves and haven't got the resources to buy in tuition? Is not just an intellectual exercise. Having somebody in the room who knows something about it would definitely improve the quality of the evidence.
So there's sort of two things there. One is the sort of the kind of churn issue of moving on constantly, and the other is the background issue in terms of where you're from. Would you say that they are equally problematic, or would you say that one is more problematic than the other in terms of causing
you're asking me to rank churn versus diversity?
Yeah. If they can be ranked.
If I had to choose, I don't see why ministers should choose. I mean, one of the things, ministers are in charge, they can have whatever they want. I understand why they don't prioritise asking this question, because they've got other ones, but they can have both. If I had to choose, I would choose having experts from a range of different perspectives in the room, changing more quickly, than a group of people, all of who've got the same experience, staying in the role forever. Okay. But I don't see why you would want to choose. I can't put this any better than the Social Mobility Foundation in their 2017 report, in which they interviewed hundreds of people, and they noted that the socioeconomic diversity of the senior civil service had got a bit less in the last 40 years. And they described the culture as studied neutrality, in which what really mattered to your prospects of getting onwards and upwards, were your literary illusions, not your evidence-based advice to ministers.
And there's been a current trend to move civil service jobs out of London to various regional hubs across the country. Do you think that would be sufficient to bring that great, or do you think that will bring any greater diversity of background or thought to the civil service? And do you think that would be sufficient, or is more needed than that?
So I definitely think it helps to recruit people into any of these professions, but the focus of this conversation is the policy professions. Definitely it helps to improve the quality of the policy profession if you're recruiting from the widest possible range of backgrounds. Bizarre, in a way, that until fairly recently, you can only join the policy profession if you live near London. Why would you want to reject anybody who happens to live in Manchester or Cornwall or Sheffield, Birmingham? And so it definitely helps. But it'll only really help if you're addressing this cultural problem that I'm describing too. If you get somebody in from the sticks, to advise on what it's like for people in Manchester. And then you go back to your way of doing things, a bit like we don't want scientists in our profession, then nothing really has changed.
Plenty of Oxford PPists in Manchester as well as in London, I suppose. But
that would be well. That's another equally good point. If you're going to be recruiting outside a particular narrow area, make sure you're taking advantage of that. And not that I've got anything against PPE graduates wherever they live. It's just they don't all. It's just that we don't just need them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ronnie Cowan.
Thanks, Chair. Going beyond the geography of recruiting, the civil service recent approach to diversity and inclusion, there have been many, but the most recent one increases on its cognitive diversity. How do you actually recruit for cognitive diversity?
I can't say that I was involved in any such recruitment campaigns myself. I see the idea of it, and I guess it complements some of the things we've been discussing, haven't we? The notion that when you're in a room, considering what are the best ways of dealing with issue X, Y, or Z, you want people with different perspectives in the room. And that seems to be a good thing. One of, whenever there's an investigation into something that went seriously wrong, inside government or outside, one of the factors is always groupthink, isn't it? A major theme of the Chilcot inquiry was the notion of groupthink. People who didn't really argue with each other because they got the same background, same perspective. And in a culture where everything's polite.
Is there not always that danger of recruitment? You get one person interviewed, 5 people interviewing it, and they try to match themselves up to same school, same university, same background, same interests, same whatever, because they're more comfortable with that because they think they understand that person because they're like themselves. So how do you break that?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with you, and that is why the civil service doesn't change. Not so much because the people it recruits, but the people it promotes. If you're at the top of the civil service and you've got there because of the quality of your handling skills, then it can't be too bad, can it? And you're going to want to recruit people promote people in your image like you, and so it stays as it is. And so that's why, in my view, you can't rely upon the civil service to fix this problem for itself. That's why it requires either ministers or Parliament. I suggest the latter, which is why I asked for the opportunity to talk to you, but either to say this isn't good enough.
So who would do the recruiting then?
So it's not so much. So the Civil Service Commission, as you will know, is an independent body whose job is to ensure the application of the civil service values set out in statute when recruiting to the most senior positions. But its brief, as Francis Moore pointed out recently, is more to do with ensuring that when people get into senior roles, they are impartial, which is a perfectly good thing. But the issue we're discussing this morning is a different issue. Have they got the appropriate expertise? So it would need. I'm not sure you would need any new bodies. It would really be for ministers and for Parliament to be setting what are the requirements that people need to demonstrate in order to get into the more senior positions. The way this would happen.
But the ministers and Parliament not get to their positions for exactly the same reasons.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's why civil servants need to be recruited on a different basis. Why do we have a permanent civil service? Partly, precisely because of the political system in which we operate. It is the nature of parliamentary democracy that the minister in charge won't have, in most cases, any background in the subject. That's the nature of democracy, and I'm not proposing changing it. I'm saying if that's the system, make sure the civil servants know what they're talking about. And I think that the best way to ensure that the senior people do become experts in their subject is to expose their advice to public scrutiny. It's not so much the recruitment process, it's more, do you carry on doing it in secret or not? Can I give you an example of what I mean?
Please.
So, when permanent secretaries are preparing advice for ministers, there's one category of advice that they prepare which they spend much, much more time on than any other. They really work extremely hard to make sure that it is accurate and can't be pulled apart. And they employ teams of people who support them in that activity. And there is an expert team in the Treasury that makes sure they do it well. And they go on a training course as soon as they become permanent secretary to make sure they do it well. Now, I'm guessing, because you've not been a permanent secretary, you don't know what that category of advice is. That category of advice is value for money advice. They go on training courses. I went on training courses on how to do this properly. So I was an expert in that one thing. I mean, I was an expert myself in other things too, but that was what I was taught by the system to be an expert in. Why was I taught to be an expert in value for money advice? Answer, because it was public. I mean, it really is that simple. I would go along to meetings like this, chaired by Margaret Hodge and Meg Hillier, and some experts in the National Audit Office would have read the advice, and they would be able to judge whether I had done it well or badly, and they would tell the committee. And if I had done it badly, I would be roasted. But I didn't do it badly, I did it well. And I don't see why you shouldn't apply exactly that principle to all policy advice. Imagine now I've got to advise you on the different options for achieving some objective you've got. I don't know, increasing the number of students succeeding in technical subjects at college. There are 4 or 5 different approaches I might take. It's my job as a civil servant to present those impartially, whoever the politician is, pros and cons of each. Why not have an expert group of people who look at the quality of that advice? Did Mr. Slater consider each of the options? Did he set out the pros and cons? And report to the select committee, not on what the right answer is. I mean, there isn't a right answer. That's the point of politicians. The job of civil servants is to expose the choices. Some experts looking at how well they do it, overseen by Parliament. Well, it works for value for money. Why not do it for the rest? Now, the civil service is not going to invent that system for itself, which is the meeting that permanent secretaries hate more than any other meeting, the Public Accounts Committee. Inevitably, who wants to be held to account in front of a group of anybody? This is the most relaxed select committee meeting I've ever sat in, because I'm not being held to account. But accountability is good. The civil service policy-making profession is a monopoly. There's one of it. You get to stay in the job for life. This isn't the private sector, where if your advice is poor, you go. You stay. What do we do in the public sector with teachers, with doctors, with local government officials, with police officers who work in monopolies in the public sector, who are not subject to a competitive principle where if they do a poor job, their company goes down? We submit them to inspection. Why is the policy-making profession the only public sector institution which is not subject to inspection, other than in that one area? There is no good answer to that question, other than you don't invent it for yourself, and ministers are typically busy elsewhere.
It's a great answer and very interesting, but not actually the question I asked you.
I'm so sorry. I do apologise.
No, it's a great answer. Lovely. Diversity. How do I get communities of diversity? How do I get these people around the table who can say to folk, my experience, my thinking process is different from yours, and we have to hammer it out here before we go and advise a minister about what they should be doing?
Yeah, so you can do that by building it into the specification. There is a person specification set out for deputy directors, for director generals, for permanent secretaries. You could build formally that ability that cognitive diversity in, you could require the recruitment of teams to bring in people with different skill sets. You could build that into your process. You could have the Civil Service Commission overseeing it. But the reason I didn't really answer your question was that I think that a process answer won't really change it. What would change it would be exposing it to external scrutiny.
The same go for ensuring that people with greater focus on delivery are in the leadership positions and positions where they make policy and advise ministers. Same process?
Yes, and again, I mean, it's not that the civil service hasn't made any steps, any forward steps in the last 20 years. I felt very unusual in 2001 as a local authority, having a local authority background, but I wasn't the first, and there have been more since, and been people brought in from outside. I mentioned John Manzoni, so there are recruits from outside, people with more experience. So it doesn't. It's not that it doesn't change at all. And you know, there are some very good senior civil servants. Kat Little has just been appointed as the permanent secretary of the Cabinet Office. I was very impressed by Kat. I didn't work with her a lot, but you know, if the predominant culture is still as I describe it, what was the background of the current head of the civil service, which I don't blame him for, but you know, he's literally a courtier, then it doesn't really change.
So should we be recruiting more permanent secretaries from outside the civil service?
I think it would be... the job of permanent secretary is a very hard one, and as in any organisation, it's quite risky to bring in somebody from outside at that level. I would bring them in at a more junior level. I think it definitely makes... I would say that nobody should be a policy maker in the senior civil service unless they have worked for a significant amount of time outside it. I thought I was a much better permanent secretary than I would have been than I would have been otherwise. No doubt I could have been significantly better still because of the 10 years I'd spent in local government on the receiving end of Whitehall. If you've never done anything else, but again, the civil service plan, reform plan from time to time will commit to a secondment programme. We're going to 9 months out. Michael Gove announced one about 3 years ago. Another tumbleweed moment. Nothing happens. I spoke to a Director General in my department who went to see a permanent secretary. I want to go on a secondment. I've read this plan. Don't do that. Don't do that, he was told. Oh my goodness. Out of sight, out of mind. You've lost your chance to get to the top. Culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Thank you. Thank you, Ronnie. John Stevenson.
Thank you. You made a couple of interesting comments earlier. Civil servants operate in private, and obviously the comparison between local government being more open than the more private civil servants. But one of your key recommendations is that the civil service should actually publish their advice to ministers. Do you not think that would change the relationship quite dramatically between senior civil servants and ministers, and it would become a lot more transactional?
So I think if one were accepting there was a case for putting advice into the public eye, it would be definitely worth a proper discussion about how to do it. And there are different approaches that one could take. I've already mentioned one that applies to a subset of civil service advice, and the world hasn't fallen in, and there's the level of trust that there is between ministers and civil servants in circumstances where the National Audit Office looks at all of the advice and advises Parliament. So I think it definitely is possible to design a system which extends that brief more widely. But in answer to a previous question, I suggested that civil servants are spending perhaps rather more time than they should on the issues that ministers would not want to be in the public domain. How to handle the Chancellor, type questions, handling type questions. And in fact, I'm not suggesting that be put into the public domain. What I'm suggesting be put into the public domain is here are the different options for achieving the outcome you want and the evidence in support of those. That's supposed to be factual information. That's not supposed to be controversial. You're supposed to offer that advice whoever the politician is you're working for. So I think when politicians are nervous about what civil servants might say to select committees, if they were entitled to say what they think, it's not so much that they're fearful that I might say to your committee chair, the evidence about mathematics is this. I don't think they're concerned about that. They would be concerned, and I think reasonably so, by, what does Gavin Williamson really think about? That's the sort of the stuff of that's the trust issue. Am I going to say something disobliging about some minister or other? No, that's not what needs to get into the public domain. What needs to get into the public domain are the facts, are the evidence, and that's not something, in my experience, which it leads to a sort of breakdown of trust. Quite the opposite. But one could build it up bit by bit. At the very least, ask an expanded National Audit Office or equivalent body to look at the advice and to advise you.
Is there not a danger, though, that civil servants would become less candid in their advice?
So, in my view, it's the opposite. As I say, if I look at the... because we've got the opportunity to compare. That's the beauty of the fact that the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee do look at policy advice in a restrictive area. And what you see is more candid advice on value for money than more generally. More generally, the instinct is, what does the minister want? But not for value for money. No, we've got to tell it as it is. We've got to do that. It might be uncomfortable, conceivably, to tell a politician this is going to be more expensive than that. But if we don't, what are we going to say to Meg? And no, I mean, it's completely straightforwardly. That's how the system... Well, as it would, put yourself in our shoes. If the public gets to see, if you've got to defend your own advice to a committee, you're going to make sure it's right. It's that simple. If you don't have to... Are these induction meetings? People joining the Department for Education would listen to me talk about the importance of truth to power, and they would say to me, at most of these induction meetings, somebody would say to me, but is that what ministers really want? They've only just started. They've just joined the Department for Education. Does Nick Gibb really want advice on X or Y? Nick, because he was a minister for 10 years. And I would say yes. And that was true. I've been in lots of meetings with Nick Gibb in which he and I would do the truth to power thing, and he absolutely relished it. He welcomed it. But it's really not how the system works. If you wanted to avoid change the system because you're fearful that civil servants are not being candid, would become less candid. They couldn't become less candid.
Do you not think there's a danger, though, that once civil service advice becomes public and they are interviewed by select committees, etc., they then enter the political sphere in a way that we don't necessarily want them to do so?
So I think that, again, I'm trying to distinguish here between two different roles that civil servants play in the policy making. One, the submission of impartial, honest evidence that your colleague was asking me about, and the other, the sort of handling type stuff. You know what I mean by that. And I'm talking about putting into the public domain the former. And I'm not completely convinced that politicians are particularly well served by senior civil servants doing the latter. And so to take an example of a different country, New Zealand, parliamentary democracy, impartial officials, permanently appointed, the civil servants do much more the former, and they do much less of the latter. Now, you could call that transactional if you want, but I would say it's the civil service doing its core job. So a Director General who worked for me in the Department of Education went to be the head of the policy function for the Children's Department in New Zealand for 18 months. For various reasons, doesn't matter what they were. He then came back. What was it like? I said to him, it's amazing. I had a meeting with my minister on my policy once a week, rather than 3 times a day. That's the system. You could describe that as more transactional. And at first he thought, I don't really understand it. But actually, if you think about it, you know, how much did the policy change? Why would you be having quite so many meetings with a minister? Answer, because you're involved in this sort of handling activity. I would give more of that activity to special advisors and extended ministerial offices, and I would invest properly in civil servants who were doing the thing that only civil servants can do properly. Well, obviously you could have a different system, but the point of a permanent civil service is not to be handlers on call, but to be experts in education.
Okay, so assuming they're experts, and assuming there's a policy that's taken forward, and the policy goes a little bit haywire, should the civil servant resign?
So I think that under the model I'm describing, the civil servants are accountable for the quality of their advice.
Not for the quality of the implementation of the policy?
Oh, sorry, of course, apologies, and also for the quality of their implementation. One of the reasons why I think these discussions sometimes go wrong is that the word accountability very quickly turns into the word sack. You know, who's going to get sacked? And that's sort of the nature of the political system we operate in, and it's not easy being a minister or an MP. I would say that in any walk of life, I would say this would be true of politicians, civil servants, people in the private sector, you'd need a pretty egregious failure of advice or implementation to sack somebody. I mean, obviously it will happen, clearly, if something incredibly obvious hadn't been spotted, which it certainly should have been by an expert, or if they made an obvious fail. Implementation
isn't always just about policy going wrong. It is about actually delivering the policy properly.
Yes, and if the delivery fail is so egregious that you've got no excuse, and it's clearly the fault of one person, then goodbye. But in my experience, that's rarely the case. In my experience, both the advice and the implementation are for involved teams of people. One of the reasons why politicians and civil servants meet each other as frequently as they do is that it's not a sort of, we've decided what we want, now just get on with it. It iterates over time, doesn't it, going to and fro. It involves civil servants, local government officials, the private sector. It's complicated. So I would say accountability, in my view, is much more about openness, transparency, learning from what's not worked. But certainly, if a civil servant's advice or implementation has been so poor that it should have been easy to have got it right, and they've been given the resources, the ability to do it properly, and they still messed it up, then obviously they should be to take the consequences for it, of course.
Final question, just on ministerial directions, which is obviously something that is used on occasion in our system. What's your views on them? Are they of value? Do they work well, or could they be used more often?
So, when the Treasury decided 150 years ago to give the civil service this responsibility of and the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee and these ministerial directions, that was a good thing to do, and that's, I guess, why it still remains in place today. It obviously is, in a democracy, completely reasonable for a minister to choose an option which is poorer value for money, seen in narrow terms, than another option. That's a completely legitimate task. That's why politicians should make these decisions, because they're not straightforward often. But if the minister is choosing to do something which is poor value for money, then it makes sense from the Treasury's point of view to know that was despite the advice of the civil service. That's what the Treasury wanted. They wanted to make sure that permanent secretaries were at least telling the minister what the value for money option was. And so that's why the ministerial direction system arises. I'm arguing that if you did the same for everything else, it's completely fine for ministers to choose one piece of evidence over another piece of evidence. But did the civil service give them it all? At the moment, that question is not asked. You've got to wait for 20 years to find out.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Lord Russell Moyle.
Thank you. ministers are largely absent in your analysis of policy functioning. Is that because you think the problem lies exclusively with the civil service? Or are there issues around ministerial longevity and the such like that also need to be addressed in this conundrum?
Yes, as you say, I wasn't writing about ministers, which is not because I think there's nothing wrong with politics. It's just I was focusing on one thing in my pamphlet, which was about the civil service. And the key point I was trying to make in respect of the politics was that it's not the minister's fault that the civil service operates as it does. But obviously I could have written a different pamphlet about politics. But I don't write about politics. I've not been a politician.
That young civil servant who said, would Nick Gibb want to hear that, does that also, it takes two to tango, doesn't it? It takes the other side, the minister, to be making clear that they want to receive impartial advice, and if they're not doing that, the civil service will react in a democracy likewise.
You're absolutely right, and all I'm saying is that not a single minister, not one of the dozens of ministers I worked for 20 years ever gave me any reason to think that they were part of this problem. So I worked for Justine Greening. She's just become Education Secretary. She asked for a piece of advice. You could do X, Y, or Z. She comes back on her private office, comes back on her behalf to the official, yes, but which do you think is the best option? In those circumstances, the response she got back was, well, it depends what you want. I never saw any examples of ministers saying, I don't want the advice. What I often saw was examples of ministers who were a bit frustrated that the civil servants working for them didn't know. I worked for Damien Hines. He would, at most of his meetings with the policy officials, he would say, what's going to happen during this meeting is that I'm going to engage in discussion with you, and I'm going to listen to you, and I'm going to throw some ideas out, but I really, really don't want you, just because I've said something, to assume we're going to do it. I'm just having a discussion with you to see what you think. And as you could see, as soon as he said something, I'm writing it down. And he would have to keep, he felt he needed to say this every time. Damien Hines, who's nicer than Damien Hines? This is not a party political point I'm making. Every time he felt he needed to say to the civil servants, say what you think. Don't just listen to me and write it down. Even then, they wrote it down.
If you go back to Mr. Stephen's point then, if you publish that conversation, can that conversation happen?
Yes, I'm not suggesting publishing every conversation. I'm saying, following the...
There needs to be a clear delineation between what is advice and what is a conversation, and how do you do that?
In exactly the same way as it's done by the National Audit Office for value for money advice. When it's committed to paper and it's a formal recommendation, it's been signed off by the Permanent Secretary.
So, apart from the publishing of advice, how do you change that culture? Or is the publishing advice the golden ticket that civil servants will speak truth to power? And particularly if we look at the treatment of Sir Tom, the Treasury Permanent Secretary, who was dismissed for apparently speaking truth to power in private. Does that not set a tone that's going in the opposite direction of what you're suggesting?
Tom didn't have a chance to speak truth to power. He was sacked on day one. So that is not an example of someone being sacked for truth to power. The golden... So, if I were forced to choose, which was the thing that would make the biggest difference, I would say the independent inspection, the independent analysis of that advice. I think it'd be much better to put it in the public domain. But it stands to reason, doesn't it? If you have an independent group of experts who are looking at the quality of something and advising on it, that will improve the quality of it. You don't have to publish it, I guess, to get the same benefits, but I don't see why you wouldn't. When I was Director of Education in a local authority and there were too many primary schools for the number of primary school children, I had to make a recommendation as to which one should close. Yes, it's not an uncontroversial decision. And I made that advice in public because, well, that's what you do. And I didn't change the nature of my relationship with the Chair of Education.
Your NAO example with the Public Accounts Committee following it up, if you do that in policy, do you have a generalist policy unit that is advising the respective select committees, the departmental select committees, or do you need specialist units that advise? Is a generalist policy national policy audit office, whatever you want to call it, able to do that, or do you need an education policy unit to be able to understand the education, etc., etc.?
Yes, I see what you mean. I'm not convinced, as you can tell by my answers this morning, that there's much benefit to be achieved by generalists in the policy profession. What does the word generalist mean? I guess it must be someone who doesn't know very much about the subject. I mean, what is the difference between a generalist and a specialist? Clearly the person who's advising ministers needs to understand about politics and politicians and government. Obviously, they need to be able to do that. But I'm arguing they should be able to do two things. They should be able to understand the role of a Secretary of State for Education, and they should know something about education. Two things. Rather than only the first thing, which is Fulton's complaint in 1968 and still the position today. So if you had such a system, then yes, of course, then national audit obviously is audit. You would need, you would bring together a broader group of people with a broader set of skills. But just as the National Audit Office has an education team, which is staffed by people who are different from the national security team in the National Audit Office, etc., you would have to do the same for this organisation too.
It would be one organisation that then would feed to all select committees, rather than each select committee having an organisation that did its work for it. I mean, in development, for example, we have that with ICAI, which is the independent auditor for development effectiveness, and they report to the select committee, and they report on the effectiveness of the department's, now of course part of the Foreign Office, department's work. How is it significantly different from those specialist audit teams that we already have in some areas?
Yes, so I agree with you that there are some examples in government. I focused on the most high-profile one that involves a bespoke select committee, but there's more than one example, as you say, of scrutiny of the policy-making process. Which is, I guess, my answer to those who suggest that this would break the system if we made it more common. But it's very much the exception. It's very much constrained. I think that the people I'm talking about would be asking some fairly basic questions. Have you identified all the options available to the minister to help them make their decision? Have you brought to them what evidence exists? Have you identified the risks and opportunities in an impartial way? And that is a fairly generic task, actually. I'm not looking for people who are going to sort of have an argument about what's the best way of teaching maths. What are the options? Did you put them in front? Can you demonstrate that you have sought international expertise? Those sort of questions.
So generalists with an understanding of the area rather than specialists themselves. How far, on a final point, how far is it appropriate for ministers to become involved in the hiring and firing and the performance management of the civil servants serving them?
So there are countries, there are democracies in which the politicians choose the officials working for them. America is one such country. The top four, grades underneath the president are appointed by the president. There are pros and cons of such a system. I'm not saying you've got to have one system. Clearly there are countries
hybrids and things
making different choices. And yes, but you need to be careful if you do a hybrid. If you give ministers the power to recruit the people working for them, you've tipped the balance, haven't you? The president is, significantly less powerful in his or her country in America than the prime minister is in our country, because the president's got to get, Congress behind it. Whereas the prime minister in our country has, I'm not saying that's bad, it's just got a lot more power, and you need to keep the checks and balances in place. So if you were going to give ministers more power, you would need to rebalance that somewhere else, not just doing it on its own.
So that is not the area of focus that we should be meddling with at the moment?
So I think myself it's a red herring. It wouldn't address the issue I've described. How could a new education secretary, who doesn't really have any background in the subject and doesn't know where they're going to be in post in a year's time, be the right person to recruit the specialists they need working for them? By all means, appoint some people to help them with the politics, and have more of those people than they've got at the moment.
So you would, Maud talks about a kind of chef de cabinet or something like this that would be directly appointed by the minister to do some of that politics.
Yes.
More. You're talking about a whole team that would be potentially do that.
Well, there are people who do that at the moment, special advisors who work in that space, but they work alongside civil servants. I think there's rather less separation of duties than there might be. Again, if you go back to the New Zealand system, the policymakers are focusing on the expert task. The ministers are all in one building together, doing quite a lot of the politics themselves, rather than through a separate group of people.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Gideon.
Thank you. You make the point that you talk of the merits of specialists as opposed to generalists, and yet at the same time we know that career progression within the civil service means moving from department to department. How would you square the two? Because, if you're an education specialist, then shouldn't you have to remain within education rather than moving to defence? Or can you become an expert, sort of on the job, in which case you're a generalist? So that doesn't
Yes,
seem to
absolutely. So under a model in which people were promoted because of their subject matter expertise and what they've achieved in practice, what you would find would be people not stuck in one area forever, but within groups. And the civil service does think in these terms already. National security departments, Foreign Office, Defence, some parts of the Cabinet Office, and so on. Public services. The challenges facing children at school today are as much to do with the services provided by health and local government as by head teachers. So there's a sort of natural cluster we tend to call them. So I could imagine people clustering. The criminal justice cluster. You might find yourself in the Home Office, Ministry of Justice, the Attorney General's Department. This is assuming that you're working on policy questions. I made the switches that I did because I was not. I was working on business transformation, which is a cross-cutting theme and applies just as, in the case of the Ministry of Defence, they wanted somebody not from Defence to help them do transformational change, because they thought the problem with having people inside Defence doing it was that they would be, they do what they were told by the hierarchy. But in the policy-making space, you could see clusters of the sort I've described.
John Stevenson.
Thank you. Just a final question from me. Your whole thrust of your argument is that there needs to be fundamental cultural change within the civil service. And as far as I can work out, there's only three places that can come from. The civil service itself, which you said are incapable of doing it, ministers who are too busy, and the final one being Parliament. Do you detect any appetite or interest in doing that from Parliament?
I look forward to your report with interest. In all seriousness, these changes like these don't happen very often. I'm guessing at some point people will say those frustrations that ministers have about the civil service that they've had for the last 100 years, at some point there will be a moment in time. I have no particular reason to think it's today. But where does the change come from in the accountability of civil servants? It does come from, this committee. and it happens when there's an election and a change of government. It doesn't happen very often. It happened in 1979 when this committee's predecessor came up with the idea for departmental select committees, and the new Thatcher government implemented them. It happened in 97 when the predecessor of this committee came up with a plan that the chairs of the select committees should be elected by the House. These are both things which ministers might not choose to do day in, day out, but a team of members of Parliament cross-party thinking about the system and how it might change, not thinking out how it might change for the current government, but thinking how it might change afterwards. Those are the two times it's happened in the last 40 years. I don't have any particular reason to think it's going to happen this time, but you never know. And, I would encourage you to consider what you might recommend.
Randall.
Thank you. Just during the course of your evidence this morning, there's been passing references to the Fulton report that was commissioned under Howard Wilson, and the sort of tone of our discussion today has been sort of quite negative. I just wondered whether, in your view, since the 1960s, whether there's been any aspects in this area that have actually improved, or is it the case that sort of culturally we are still today where we were back under Howard Wilson's premiership?
By the way, the Haldane report in 1918 that set up the current cabinet government, Haldane himself argued that there needed to be a change to the way the departments worked in light of the issues we're describing today. So the civil service has changed a lot in the last 50 years and has improved in lots of ways. Your chair mentioned some. New skills, undeniably. But the policy-making profession, which only represents about 10% of the civil service, just as the 10% we're discussing that I wrote about, that hasn't really changed. Only in the sense that it's only a couple of pages in Fulton, but he describes an administrative class churning too fast, who never talk to the public, who know nothing about other than about the political process. I mean, those are his words. What do policy makers do? They write things down on a piece of paper and they go in red boxes with a little note handwritten on the top, So that bit of the system hasn't changed. And the people who really, there are different, nobody gains. Everybody loses. Ministers lose, they get poorer advice than they might. Those bright young civil servants who join my department, they're losing because their enthusiasm. Parliament loses. Nothing changes.
One final question from me. With the exception of special advisors, should there be any role at all for the generalist in the policy-making civil service?
I'm sorry, by generalist, you mean... Do you mean...
Generalist as opposed to specialist.
Yes, but does generalist means essentially someone who doesn't know anything about the subject?
You've said that twice, and I take your point. But should there be any place for such a person within the policy-making civil service?
So it's absolutely essential that ministers are served by people who understand about politics and understand the role of ministers and Parliament, and that is a specialist activity. I wouldn't call that generalist. That is a special activity in its own right. I think the problem with our current system is that it assumes that's enough. And I don't see why we shouldn't grow a policy profession that can do two things. Have the expertise on how to advise ministers in a political environment and know about the subject matter. I inherited, as I wrote about, 2 teams of people working on apprenticeships from the Department for Business. One headed by somebody who knew nothing about apprenticeships but was good at talking to politicians, and another headed by somebody who knew a lot about apprenticeships but never been in a room with politicians. because category A keep category B out of the room, quite literally. So what I did was to teach the guy who knew a lot about apprenticeships how to talk to ministers, so that he could do two things, and he did them very well. And I think we should, that should be how we do the thing more generally.
Thank you very much, Mr. Slater, for coming here today. I think we've all enjoyed your evidence.
Enjoy the opportunity to give it. Thank you very much.
And you'll be pleased to hear that this is the end of this session. Order, order.
Ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.